In the beginning of 1875, I arrived at Sydney, New South Wales, in command of the schooner Flora, from Samoa and Fiji, and after spending 5 years among the islands of the southwestern Pacific. During that period, I had been some time afloat as master or mate, more often ashore, living amongst the natives as a trader. I had visited New Caledonia, the Loyalty, New Hebrides, Samoa, Fiji, Caroline, Marshall, and Gilbert groups. I had also gone through a short but adventurous experience along the shores of New Britain and Duke of York Island. The Flora was sold to another firm after discharging cargo and fitted out for the Queensland Polynesian Labour Trade under the command of Captain McKay, and I was thrown out of employment. Through the good offices of the late owner of the Flora, and in consequence of my varied experience in the South Pacific, I was not long out of a berth. On February 19th, I took charge as master of the schooner Stanley, 15-tons register, built in Granton, Scotland. She was a handy, weatherly vessel, admirably suited for South Sea work, having had her recalked, coppered, and fitted with 2 suitable boats and davits. I took in cargo and sailed for Maryborough, Queensland. At Maryborough, I discharged my cargo, and the Stanley was fitted with a lower deck on top of her iron ballast, 2 long shelves or bunks 6 feet wide, extending the whole length of the hold as sleeping quarters for the expected recruits. A bulkhead of 4-inch wooden battens at a like distance apart divided the whole space into 2 unequal parts, the after one, to which there was admission by the outer hatch only, being reserved for females. On May 12th, we were ready for sea. The hull and rigging had been examined by the shipping inspector of the port, who had also measured the hold to determine how many recruits the vessel should be licensed to carry. The immigration agent had seen that the accommodation was satisfactory and that there were sufficient provisions, clothing for recruits, and blankets on board. I had signed a bond for £500 as guarantee against kidnapping. A government agent was appointed, and a license to recruit and carry not more than 109 Polynesian laborers was issued to us. Besides the government agent, I had 3 passengers, all friends of the owners. One, generally known as Kanakas, having had some experience of the islands, was to engage the natives on shore. and sailed as recruiting agent. The second was the doctor, while the third, whom we called Cash, had nothing to do but amuse himself and others. There were also 7 natives of Eromanga, laborers returning home after 3 years' service, £3 per head having been paid by their late employers for their passage. Cabin stores were liberally provided, especially all sorts of liquors from champagne down to square gin and schnapps. A dinner at the Royal, given by the owner to the cabin party and other friends, and a drunk and free fight forward among the hands. It took place on the eve of departure, and before heads were level, the schooner was dropping down the River Mary in charge of Pilot Minahan. Opposite the mouth of the Mary, and parallel with the coastline, lies Fraser Island, long and low, remarkable only for its sterility. There is abundance of fresh water, however, and the island is used as a reserve for the few aboriginals of the district whom rum and civilization have not yet killed off. At Fraser Island, we lay off the White Cliffs for 3 days, taking in water and firewood. As soon as the tanks were filled and the vacant space between the bunks and the lower deck stocked with good split logs of she-oak for firewood, the anchor was hove up for good, and the schooner headed northward in order to reach the open ocean round Breaksea Spit, beyond the northern point of the island. The first week of the voyage was spent in beating against a strong southeasterly breeze, taking advantage of the steady southerly current which runs along the coast from here to Cape Howe. A little to the southward of Cape Morton, the breeze died away and was followed by a fresh westerly wind, which gave us a splendid run to the reefs off the southeast end of New Caledonia, and thence past Walpole Island to North Bay Mary Island, one of the Loyalty Group, a dependency of the French colony of New Caledonia. Here we lay 2 days, engaging as boatmen 4 strapping natives of the island, whom we agreed to re-land on our way home. A native of Mary Island, whom I had shipped in Maryborough as boatman for the voyage, attempted to desert here, probably influenced by his friends on shore. I had some difficulty in getting him back to the beach and on board, after discovering him concealed in a hut about a mile inland. However, I offered a reward for his apprehension, not payable until he was safe on board. So interested parties helped me, and he went the voyage with me until our return. From Mare to Tanna Island, New Hebrides, occupied us a day, and recruiting, or at least an attempt to recruit, commenced near Black Beach, a well-known anchorage on the lee side of the island. The first day's attempt at recruiting in Tanna Island resulted in disappointment. Few natives were seen, and these were chiefly very old men or children. The able-bodied of both sexes were all inland, attending a sing-sing, as their native feasts and dances are termed in South Sea English. During the afternoon, I anchored the ship in 10 fathoms of water, about 200 yards from shore near the northern end of Black Beach. A moderate breeze from the southeast was blowing all day, with fine weather, and I considered we were in perfect safety for the night, but it was not so. Just before sunset, a dense black bank of cloud rose in the southeast over the land. Still, as the barometer remained tolerably high and steady, I thought little of it, merely anticipating a deluge of rain. I certainly never expected the wind to shift from the southeast quarter with a high glass. Gradually but swiftly, 2/3 of the sky became overcast with clouds of a dark red hue, the northwest quarter alone remaining bright with the sunset glow. Then came a blinding flash of lightning and a rattle of thunder, and seeing that I must expect something out of the common, I had the mainsail double reefed and one of the boats hoisted up to the davits. There was no time to hoist the other, which was lying astern. For a moment, a small breeze sprang up from the northwest. Within 2 minutes from its commencement, a hard gale was blowing from the same quarter, accompanied by blinding rain, thunder, and lightning. Luckily, we had good holding ground, for I could not get under way now. The second anchor was let go, and chain paid out on both. The gale lasted for about an hour and a half, and veered to south, gradually dying away at southwest. By midnight, we had clear weather and the usual southeast trade wind again. Our boat astern was swamped, but luckily uninjured. The breeze was a small but true cyclone, traveling in a northerly direction, a most unusual phenomenon, the only instance I recollect of a cyclone occurring in the month of June in these waters. The barometer and aneroid fell only 20 degrees during the cyclone. Black Beach and its neighborhood proving a failure, the anchor was tripped next day, and the western shores made for in search of recruits. The southwest coast of Tanna gave us a few recruits, and then I steered for Port Resolution, where I anchored in the middle of the harbor. At that time, it was a smooth and safe anchorage during the trade winds. But in 1877, an earthquake occurred which raised the northwest side of the port and shoaled it in so much that it is now suitable only for the smallest vessels. I anchored there in 1880 in the Jabberwock, but I had auxiliary steam power, or I should not have attempted it. I weighed anchor and left Port Resolution on a Sunday morning, running down to Anawa, a small island about 12 miles to the north, where I kept the ship dodging under the lee, there being no anchorage, whilst the boats visited the shore. A mission station had been established here 2 or 3 years before, I believe, but the missionary was then absent on board the Dayspring, so our party did not visit his residence. A former chief of Port Resolution was living on the island with a few of his followers, one of whom we recruited. Old Mikey had been a big chief in Port Resolution when I knew him 5 years before, but his reign was over now, and he was an outlaw. Another recruit we obtained here was a native of the island. This boy, whose name was Naihu, had served the missionary for some time as a house servant. When his employer went away on his present trip, he locked his kitchen door. Some of Nihu's clothes were being left inside. After Nihu's departure in the Stanley, the boy's relatives, knowing that his clothes were there, broke into the kitchen, abstracted them, and told the missionary, on his return, that the crew of the Stanley were the burglars. Before the year was out, every man in the group, and the news went further than that, knew that the reverend gentleman accused Captain Wawn of breaking into his house. The kitchen, by the way, was a building detached from the dwelling house. I suppose it was not worth his while to sift the matter properly, so long as he could get a good story to tell against a slaver. Many of the stories told by this gentleman about labor vessels have just as good a foundation, and no better. From Anawa, we crossed to Eromanga. We visited Cook's Bay on the east, and afterwards landed our returns at their home, Noras, on the southwest coast. When the boats were seen pulling in towards Noras, a crowd of about 100 men mustered to meet them, no women or children being visible. This was a bad sign, but the sight of the returns with their boxes and bundles appeared to put most of them in a better temper. No other recruits were forthcoming, so we left and squared away for Sandwich Island. Villa Harbor and Maley Island proving unproductive in the way of recruits, we kept on to the north, passing Havana Harbor on the northwest coast of Sandwich Island, a common port of call for vessels visiting this group. Ma'i, or Three Hills Island, was next tried. The anchorage here is in a bay on the northwest side, a wide fringed reef of which extends over half a mile out from the shore along the whole length of the island. The inhabitants of Mahi and those of the Shepherd Islands to the eastward, one of which, Tongua, was in sight from this anchorage, speak the Sandwich Island language and have the same dress and customs. Apia Island, with the peak of Lopave appearing over and beyond it, lay to the north. We did fairly well and spent a couple of days here before running over to the west coast of Api. Running over to the west coast of Api, I anchored in Ibu Bay, about 3 miles beyond the southwest point, in 9 fathoms. This is a good watering place, and as there is no village of salt water or coast natives here, we had free communication with several inland tribes, Manabush as they are termed in South Sea English. Thence we worked the west coast as far as Duane, the northwestern point. We engaged 2 or 3 recruits on this coast, but the fact of the recruiter and the boat's crew being comparative strangers militated against us, owing to frequent kidnappings by vessels from Fiji, Honolulu, Samoa, and possibly also from Queensland and New Caledonia. The inhabitants were very chary about venturing near the boats when they saw them manned by strangers. We engaged a man named Sorso to act as boatman and interpreter at Malakolo, where we intended to proceed shortly. We had now great hopes of making a good haul at Paima Island, which we visited after leaving Api. The recruiter had some boys from this island working under him in Queensland. These had since returned home, and he made sure that he would meet some old acquaintances who would either engage again themselves or prevail upon others to accompany us. However, we were grievously disappointed, and we sailed away again without taking a man or woman out of the island. As the boats were being pulled off to the ship, a shot was fired at them from the shore. But fortunately, the bullet flew wide of the mark. I mention this as being the first shot, if I recollect aright, fired at my boats in this trade, though afterwards it often occurred. In fact, I never made a voyage either in this or the Solomon groups without most of us experiencing the sensation of a bullet or an arrow whistling past us occasionally. We engaged 3 or 4 boys on the northwest coast, and 2 men promised to steal away at night with their wives from their village. I stood close in to the coast at night and sent the boats to a spot appointed as the rendezvous, but we were disappointed. Fresh water was now running short on board, and as there's no convenient watering place on this side of Ambrim, I squared away and ran down to Narovorovo on the west coast of Aurora Island. I might have obtained a fresh supply on Pentecost Island, but at this time I was not at all acquainted with that island. The natives of Aurora Island hardly come up to the standard of Papuans in these waters. A large proportion of the men appeared to me stunted and misshapen. The village nearest to the anchorage at Narovorovo is situated about a mile away northward, and the inhabitants did not make an appearance until we had been at anchor some hours. It was then afternoon. Our watering was all completed, but the boats were still at the beach. Our party were enjoying the luxury of a bath in the running stream. A number of the recruits disported themselves in the sea or on the beach. Fortunately, the Maori men and other boatmen had been posted all day within the outskirts of the dense forests overhanging the beach, and were concealed from view. Suddenly, without warning, a long line of about 50 savages issued from the forest about 200 yards from the boats, making directly for them at a run Possibly they thought they had the whole party cheap, but they pulled up short about 50 yards off, when out from the trees and bushes rushed our Maori and Tanna men, outflanking them, each with a gun ready in his hand. They changed their attitude at once, but as no women or children accompanied them, and they were all fully armed with bows and poisoned arrows, spears, clubs, and tomahawks, it was quite plain what their object had been. Besides, they had brought nothing with them for sale. Some conversation then took place between the two parties, after which the natives began to slowly return to their village. Suddenly one of them turned and let fly an arrow at one of the boatmen. It missed its mark, and in a few moments not one of them was to be seen. Our fellows chased them into the forest without firing a shot. From Aurora Island, we went to Port Sandwich and Malakolo Island, speaking with Her Majesty's schooner Alacrity on the way at the east end of Aoba, or Leper's Island. Port Sandwich is one of the few safe harbors in this group. It is a long, narrow bay about 4 miles in extent, but the anchorage is very limited, the outer position being 2 deep and 2/3 of the whole port being blocked by coral patches or mud banks. The entrance is contracted by jutting coral reefs. The French New Hebrides Company have now a trading station on Sandy Point. The fringe reefs on the southeast side have to be carefully avoided, as near Sandy Point they extend a considerable distance from the shore. There is also a large native village on this side near the entrance. The habitations are scattered about the hills on both sides. 2 small rivers flow into the harbor, one, the Erskine, on the west side, and the other, unnamed, into the extreme head, but neither of them affords a suitable watering place. The Malakolo natives differ to no great extent from the others, being just as savage and warlike. During the previous year, a native boat's crew from Sandwich Island had been tomahawked and speared to death on the sandy point abreast of where we lay. They were, however, very friendly towards us, and several men soon came off on a tour of inspection, most of them in a canoe and 2 or 3 by swimming. We gleaned 3 men here, then stood northward along the coast. From Port Sandwich, Malakolo Island, we ran down the coast for about 3 miles to Bangon Bay, which is well sheltered from the trade winds, anchoring there half a mile from the shore. We got 4 boys very quickly. One youngster who had been some years among white people volunteered as interpreter and made himself very useful. Interpreters seldom join as recruits themselves. However, as the boat was being pushed off from the beach with the 4 recruits, this youngster quietly said to the recruiter, "Now, mate, very good you by me." A knife, a tomahawk, etc., were accordingly passed ashore to the friends of the lad, and he filled the office of cabin boy on board for the remainder of the voyage to Maryborough. On the north of Mangan, a long point and coral reef extend about 4 miles out from the coast. In the second bay southward of this point is situated the large and populous village of Marabui. Here I hove to, and the recruiter pulled off to the beach under the village. For some reason, I forget what, the second boat did not leave the ship until the recruiter had already got among the natives. A crowd of about 200 surrounded his boat as soon as he touched the sand, and seized her, with all her crew in her, pulled her up almost clear of the water. They evidently meant mischief, and probably the whole boat's crew would have been massacred had they rashly offered resistance. Luckily, the ship lay within rifle shot, and the second boat, with the mate and the government agent in her, pulled quickly off to assist the first. The natives then retreated, leaving the boat and its occupants unharmed. The latter were glad to get back to the ship, although unsuccessful. From the long reef we ran down the coast to the northwest until opposite the center of the island. There extensive fringe reefs were seen, and northward of the first small islet a deep bay appeared. This has the mainland on the southwest, and on the opposite side a low, curved promontory of coral formation, thickly wooded. At the extreme end of this is the inhabited islet of Uyuriki. In the midst of the bay are some large reefs and islets, on the extreme north of which I anchored in 18 fathoms. The sun was very low when I arrived, and I was glad to find bottom anywhere, though this was hardly a safe anchorage. The islet of Orambau is situated about a mile northward of Uyuriki, a deep channel lying between. The day after our arrival, the boats visited the mainland at various points, but the natives were very shy. Sorso, the interpreter engaged at Lamen Island, conversed with them. However, at one point more than a dozen crowded about the recruiting boat. We never knew what the arguments they used to induce Sorso to desert, but after a while he made an excuse to go up the beach into the bush, and on that day we saw him no more. The natives quietly but quickly slipped away, leaving 2 iron tomahawks and some bows and arrows behind them on the sand. As Sorso did not return, search was made for him in the vicinity of the boats, but no trace of him being found. The recruiter came to the conclusion that he had deserted, though at first fancying he might have been killed. To make up for his loss, a small brindled pig was captured and brought off, together with the abandoned weapons. Not liking the present anchorage, on account of a heavy swell setting in round the point of Uyuriki Island, I shifted our moorings next day to the south end of the islet. As soon as we had anchored again, several canoes left the islet filled with women and children, apparently clearing out to the main for safety. A needless precaution on their part. Some 7 or 8 men ventured alongside, however, after our boats had paid a visit to the beach near the village, and then confidence was restored, and by the next morning all the runaways had returned. The trades were now blowing almost a gale of wind, but we lay sheltered in smooth water, the boats meanwhile coasting all around the bay in search of recruits, but without success. On the mainland no natives appeared, probably owing to Sorso's secession. Just before dawn, the second night we spent here, I was awakened by the anchor watch, one seaman, running aft and calling out to me after a fleet of canoes were coming down on the ship from the head of the harbor. Mindful of Captain McLeod's experience in the Mascalines a year or two before this, and how a fleet of canoes attacked his vessel, the Donald McLean, and were only beaten off after sharp fighting, I immediately roused all hands, and in a minute or two the deck bristled with arms, and every preparation was made for repelling an attack. The cries became more distinct and drew nearer, making us sure we were in for a fight. However, it turned out at length that the sounds proceeded from one person only, and presently a canoe with a single occupant came into view out of the darkness, driving down to the ship before the wind. A rope thrown from the bows was caught and made fast, and then the deserter, Sorso, shivering in his old shirt, and as pale as is possible for a brown skin to become, climbed on deck. His story was soon told. The natives had persuaded him to bolt, pretending they had ascertained that we meant to carry him off to Queensland. At first they treated him well, but during the second night he had overheard the headman saying it was their intention to make meat of him. So he ran off into the bush, and had kept himself concealed there during the previous day. When night fell, he coasted around the bay, stole a canoe, and made for the ship, knowing that a thrashing was the worst he had to expect from us. Even this he escaped, an unmerciful chafing being all the punishment dealt out to him. We broke up his stolen canoe for firewood, and then got under way, it being now broad daylight. Thence I shaped a northerly course, passing the northeast islands, which Sorso called Sissi, a word meaning small. Having arrived off the northwestern coast of St. Bartholomew Island, I dropped anchor in 12 fathoms to the east of a dangerous projecting reef, commonly known as the Robert Towns Reef. This was named after a Sydney bark which had been wrecked on it some 2 or 3 years before this. Here we had the good fortune to engage a few recruits, and then beat back in an easterly direction, passing between St. Bartholomew and Malacolo Island. St. Bartholomew, or as the natives call it, Mario, is entirely of coral formation, I believe, the western end being elevated to 800 feet, the eastern portion being low. The channel between it and the south coast of Espiritu Santo is dangerous, except with a fair and commanding breeze, being much beset with reefs, and the tides running very strongly through it. The eastern end of the channel is generally known as Mario Pass, or Passage, and in it anchorage can be obtained at various depths. On the southeast coast there was a sheltered bay formed by 2 low islets connected with the main island by a reef. The north shore of Mario Pass is not formed by the mainland, Espiritu Santo Island itself, but by the island of Aurora, which another channel divides from the main. These channels are connected on the west. The eastern extremity of the northernmost of them, which is known as Segund Channel, terminates in a bay behind Tatuba, an islet lying off the southeastern corner of Espiritu Santo Island. The inhabitants of Mario Pass have acquired an unenviable reputation. Probably nowhere throughout the South Seas are natives conspicuously careful of the virtue of chastity. Here in St. Bartholomew and Aurora Islands it is still less understood or appreciated, and in the lack of it the women of these islands may be fairly said to bang Banagher. At daybreak one morning we found ourselves a mile to windward of the western end of Auba, or Leper's Island. It was then blowing half a gale from the southwest with dirty weather. Squaring away before the breeze, we soon found smooth water under the lee of the island. Viewed at a distance, either from north or south, it resembles a whale's back, consisting of a huge rounded mountain lying east and west. The inhabitants of this island are extremely treacherous and very hostile to white men. This they have proved on a number of occasions, murdering and afterwards eating those who fell into their hands. The afternoon of our arrival at Leper's Island, the schooner was lying almost becalmed under the lee of the lofty central portion of the island, about 3/4 of a mile from the shore. The boats were in sight at some distance. The recruiter, with whom were the doctor and Cash, had run his boat into a small nook on the rocky coast under a high bank, above which stood a solitary hut backed by dense forest. The government agent and mate in the second boat lay about 400 yards to the westward. Suddenly we heard the sound of firing, followed by yells from the natives on shore, and then we saw the recruiter's boat push out with a seemingly diminished crew. The mate's boat pulled quickly up, took her in tow, and presently brought her alongside. All her own crew being more or less hurt, it seems the natives had called them into the place on pretense of friendship. A crowd gathered about the stern of the boat, and several fellows even got into her. All of a sudden our men were attacked with clubs and tomahawks. The recruiter escaped the first blows aimed at him, making play with his fists until he had an opportunity to draw his revolver. Tom Sayers, a merry man, received a tomahawk blow on the head, which laid the scalp open, but did not penetrate his skull, fortunately. Bobby Towns, another Maori boatman, had both his thumbs cut in warding off blows, one of them being so nearly severed from the hand that the doctor had to finish that operation. Lahu, a Laifu boy, the recruiter's special attendant, was cut and pricked in various places, but nowhere seriously. Jack, an unlucky Tana recruit, who had been engaged to act as boatman, received an arrow through his forearm, the head of which, a piece of bone 7 or 8 inches long, was still in the limb, protruding from both sides when the boats returned. The doctor and Cash were both thrown down in the boat at the commencement of the affray and suffered no hurt. The recruiter would have got off scot-free had not an arrow pinned one of his fingers to the loom of the steering oar just as they were getting off. The fight had been short, but sharp. Considering the numbers of the Auba men and the unexpectedness of the attack, it is a wonder that all our people were not massacred. The enemy lost 2 men at least, both shot dead. None of the arrows that wounded our men proved to be poisoned, happily. Tom Sayers had received the most serious injury. At first I was afraid he would lose his life, the gash on his head looking bad enough. However, when the doctor overhauled him, it was found that the thickness of his skull had saved him. Had he been a white man, the bone would certainly have given way under the blow he had received. After dark, the clouds cleared off the land, the true trade wind filled the sails again, and a course was shaped for the northern end of Aurora, or Maiwu Island. Next morning I anchored off Lakariri, or the Double Waterfall, and lay there 2 days and nights. Lakariri was the turning point of the voyage. From thence we shaped a homeward course, usually working back through the group against the trade wind by night, and in the daytime keeping near the boats as they pulled along the lee shores of the islands, looking for recruits. On the western and southern coasts of Appy Island, the inhabitants complained so much of the ravages of measles and of its frequent consequence, dysentery, that we did not delay there long. One day I anchored off Sakau on the southeast coast of Appy Island, the wind then blowing lightly from the northeast with a rather dull, cloudy sky. Towards evening the sky became still more overcast, with a threatening aspect towards northeast. About 7 p.m. a vivid flash of lightning showed in the same quarter. I immediately weighed anchor and got both boats out ahead, the northerly wind being exceedingly light, to tow the vessel out of the anchorage. Having gained a mile of offing, I hoisted in my boats, and had hardly done so when a violent squall of wind, accompanied by thunder and lightning and dense rain, burst upon us. Having taken good bearings before it reached us, I was enabled to point the ship's head so as to run for the open sea, passing between my island and the Shepherd Islands. I expected this breeze would last through the night, since the barometer was rather low and showed no sign of rising, but I was wrong in my calculations. When we were nearly abreast of the east end of Mighty Island, the wind lessened for a while, then hauling around into the south, increased to a gale. This necessitated our beating about under short canvas all night under the lee of the island, only managing to reach our anchorage by daylight next morning. Here we met 4 natives of Tongua Island who had paddled across to Maui on a visit, and were afraid to trust themselves and their canoe in the heavy sea now rolling in between them and their home. Having received a pig as payment for their passage, I shipped them and their canoe on board and crossed over to Tongua, the northernmost of the Shepherd Islands, 2 days later. Close to the western point of this island, which is mountainous and rugged, I found a stony beach with a steep bank or cliff rising behind it, above which was the native village of Panita. Here I dropped anchor. While we lay there, an unpleasant roll of the sea set in, coming round the point. The recruiter landed our passengers close under the lee of this point, as they were afraid to trust themselves among the Panita people. Caddis reported on his return that the 4 hauled up their canoe above high water mark, quickly disappearing into the bush. He subsequently saw a party of Panita men hastily following them. I only hope my late passengers got safely home, but I have some doubts about it. Next morning the recruiter was ashore on the beach with his boat's crew when the HMS Pearl hove in sight, coming around the western end of the island under sail. Shortly after, her lieutenant boarded the Stanley, overhauled the ship and my papers. This formality having been satisfactorily concluded, I repaired on board the Pearl to report the attack on my boat by the Aoba natives to Commodore Goodenough, who was then in command of the Australian squadron. After the story of the skirmish was ended, I remained more than an hour with the Commodore, giving him such information as I could with regard to harbors, anchorages, etc. In the course of conversation, he said it was very probable he would attempt to ascend the volcanoes on Ambrim Island. This I endeavored to dissuade him from doing, assuring him that he would thereby risk his own and his men's lives by exposing them to native treachery. This advice, however, he rather pooh-poohed, stating as his firm belief that savages, if kindly treated, would show no hostility. He did not attempt the ascent of the volcano after all, but very shortly afterwards he found out the mistake of trusting to the good feelings of natives, only too late, for he was mortally wounded by poisoned arrows on Natendi Island, in the Santa Cruz group. We obtained 3 recruits at Tongua, sailing thence to Havana Harbor, Sandwich Island, where we took on board wood and water. From Havana Harbor, we sailed to Tanna Island, leaving Erromanga Island unvisited, as the weather was so wet that the boats would have had small chance of success. Wet weather impedes the recruiter's work. The naked savage prefers the shelter of his hut to the less efficient cover of dripping trees. Even if he does venture out, he will not come down to the open beach where the wind would have full play upon his wet and shivering carcass. Only one day was spent at Tanna Island, and even a portion of that on board the Maryborough labor schooner Sybil, Captain Taylor, Mr. Andrews, government agent. The weather was still too wet for recruiting, no sign of a change being apparent, so, although we had only 72 recruits on board, instead of the 108th, the complement we were licensed to carry, our recruiter deemed it better to return to Maryborough at once with those that we had engaged, than to run any further risk of measles and dysentery. These diseases were both very prevalent just then in all the islands we had visited. Accordingly, towards evening, the boats were secured, the yards braced sharp up on a port tack, the ensign thrice dipped, goodbye to the Sybil, and off we went on our way home, shaping our course so as to weather the southern extremity of New Caledonia. During the whole cruise among the islands, we had been as careful to avoid infection as was possible, consistently with the work of recruiting, and especially had we made it a rule not to enter any of the native huts. However, as it turned out, one of our boatmen had disobeyed orders in this respect by allowing himself to be beguiled into a hut in the mission village at Havana Harbor. The consequence was that on the day after our departure from Tanna, he was taken ill, and the doctor pronounced his case to be one of measles. Of course, this spread consternation throughout the ship. The boat on the port davits, being on the weather side, was selected as a hospital. A tarpaulin was rigged up over it for a roof, and planks were laid across the thwarts for patients to lie on. Happily, we had not much occasion to use our hospital. However, this being the only case of measles we were destined to have on board, it proved to be a slight attack and did not spread. Another boy, even, lay in the boat by the side of the first patient without taking the infection. He had only a severe cold, though at first it was feared he was going to develop measles also. We weathered the extensive reefs off the southeastern coast of New Caledonia, running thence with a fair wind to Maryborough. The current set very strongly, as was variably off the Isles of Pines. Several times we experienced rips over what looked like surf breaking upon coral reefs. As we were nearing Breaksea Spit, Fraser Island, the wind fell very light, hauling round to northwest, and the current carrying us southward at the time. I was therefore obliged to make for Wide Bay Bar at the southern end of Fraser Island, instead of rounding the northern point of the Spit and reaching Maryborough by way of Harvey Bay. After some further difficulties of a similar sort, I beat in over the bar with the flood against a westerly wind and anchored near the pilot station. The pilot boarded us off the station and took the Stanley up to her anchorage. Of course, he was informed before he came on board that we had had a case of measles, as likewise that the ship was now clear of that disorder. However, no sooner was the anchor down than he left the ship, no doubt deeming discretion the better part of valor. Next day he sent his coxswain to take the Stanley on to Maryborough, where we arrived about the end of August. As soon as the ship was moored alongside the river bank opposite to the town, the sub-immigration agent came on board. This gentleman was also protector or inspector, I forget which, of Polynesians, sub-collector of customs, shipping master, and various other things. In fact, he milked the government cow to a considerable extent, filling sundry offices in his own person. With him came the government medical officer. The inspector examined our recruits as to the manner in which they had been induced to venture to Queensland, and as to the length of time they had agreed to serve, and so forth. The medical officer at the same time made a reasonably careful survey of them to ascertain that all were fit, mentally as well as physically, to do laborers' work. This being over, and all the recruits having been passed satisfactorily, during the next 3 or 4 days they were gradually engaged for service, leaving us one after another until the ship was clear of them. About a week after our arrival, the police magistrate held an inquiry into the skirmish at Leper's Island, Aoba. This affair had been made to appear much more serious than it really was by the reporter of the Brisbane Courier. In the interest of the anti-Kanaka party, he had dressed up the plain facts, adding to his account of the affray that the whites retaliated by burning villages. The inquiry over, I heard nothing more about the matter.